that music then also appears on the repertoire of the school bands as kind of, okay, this is your culture, this is Native American culture, and you can be Native American if you have to be something, rather be a white American, but if you have to be still a bit Native American, then this is your culture, not, whatever your families or your ancestors know and do, but this kind of white version, white interpretation of Native American music.
Down the rabbit hole, research rabbit holes.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Research Rabbit Holes. My guest today is Vincent Veerbeek, and we're actually having a little special episode between two countries who got eliminated from the World Cup in the round of 32. I'm sorry. It still stings. I don't know if it's the same for you, but we were very hopeful in this country, and anyway. So Vincent, you are a PhD candidate at the University of Helsinki, and we recently met at the Maple Leaf and Eagle conference in Helsinki. I think you were also part of the organizing team, right?
Yes. Yep.
Yeah, I mean, it was a wonderful conference, so you and all the other members of the organizing team did a great job. Thank you so much for doing this. I had a great time there. Anyway, so today we're going to talk about your dissertation project, which focuses on Native American history and boarding schools. Super interesting. So welcome to the podcast, Vincent.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for having me.
Right. So my first question would be, could you maybe summarize or try to summarize your dissertation project in a couple of sentences?
Sure. Yeah. So basically my dissertation, as you mentioned, looks at the government boarding schools that the United States operated for Native American children to kind of assimilate and quote unquote civilize Native Americans. And I do so through the lens of their music programs, specifically the marching bands. So most of the larger schools had marching bands, very elaborate, and we'll get into the details of that, but I basically examined this kind of phenomenon of kind of how it came to be, why it was important for the schools, and then I examined questions of identity as well, kind of seeing what the schools tried to do in terms of identity through the bands and what the students themselves did with that.
This is such an original project, and I was wondering, how did you even get the idea for it? Was your master's thesis kind of in a similar direction?
Yeah, so I started doing research on the broad topic of boarding schools during my master's. My master's thesis was not related to music. My master's thesis was about another fascinating thing that related more to economic education at the schools in the 1930s, which was really fascinating, but I wasn't sure if I wanted to do economic history for a full dissertation. But I'd done a little bit of research on the music program at one of the schools, Sherman Institute in Riverside, California. And so, I was really intrigued by the bands, and there have been two major studies on music at the schools. One looking at the history of music at one of the major schools up in Oregon. The other kind of a general study of music in federal Indian policy in the late 19th and early 20th centuries that also talks about the boarding schools and the bands as well. But there hadn't really been kind of a project of this scope looking just at the marching bands and kind of asking the kinds of questions that I'm asking. And so I was really interested in that kind of from the academic side of things. And then on the other side of it too was the fact that the bands, I think, are a really interesting way into this history and a side of this history that people don't really know about. And then also an aspect of the history that really shows the complexities of it, where the bands were very much part and parcel of the overwhelmingly negative character of the schools and the assimilation and all of that. But then at the same time, they provided a lot of opportunities for students as well. And so there's really those different sides to it that I found very intriguing and I think are very important to take into consideration when we think about this history.
Mm-hmm. And are you generally interested in music? Do you also maybe play an instrument?
Yes, that definitely helped as well. I play a bit of piano myself, nothing professional, but But yeah, I have an interest in music, but it's also one of those things, and that was definitely one of the things that I was kind of curious about as well as I started this research, kind of the broader question of kind of in today's society, music is always everywhere. You know, you're on the street, you're in a store, there's always music.
Right.
But that wasn't, of course, that wasn't the case in the late 19th century. And so, but at the same time, music was very present, especially in the boarding schools. There was um, a lot of different music organizations, and the bands were very present. And so there was that kind of question of just the very human question of what does it mean to be, as a child, put into a context where you can engage with your own music and the music of your ancestors, and instead have to engage with all of this other music. So yeah, there was definitely some of that as well. But then, even though I like music and I'm interested in music, I've been, I've had moments where I was several years into the project where I talk with people who know more about music or musicologists who ask me things, and I'm like, oh, I never thought about that. So that's been interesting as well. Like I've learned a lot about music as well through this project.
That sounds so cool. And you've already mentioned the Sherman Institute, which is also so one of the articles you shared with me as a preparation for this interview was also about this specific school. So I wanted to ask you, do you focus on a specific set of boarding schools, or do you focus on like a geographical area in the United States? Like how do you limit the amount of like research you have to do, or maybe like the scope of the schools that you're looking into?
Yeah, that's one of the big challenges with this. And I decided early on not to do just one school or comparative study because I feel like that would get quite similar findings. So I kind of draw on material from everywhere. So there was kind of a distinction between the so-called off-reservation schools like Sherman Institute and then reservation schools. So schools that were either on reservations where students or where children wouldn't be as far away from home. And then there were the larger off-reservation schools, which were very much designed to separate children from their communities and their families. And so my focus is more on those off-reservation schools, but there are still around 25 of those. Um, so I kind of pick up examples from different schools on and off reservations. Um, and then within the off-reservation schools, I primarily look at the larger ones that had school newspapers, ones that have more extensive records that have survived. And so I think that narrows it down to less than 10, I think closer to 7 or 8. So there's Sherman Institute, there's Carlisle, which was the first in which opened in 1879, which was the first larger off-reservation school. That is a very important one. And then there's various other bigger schools that were important at the time, that were smaller schools, but that still had very influential bands. So Phoenix Indian School, for example. There's a couple others.
Were the schools on reservations also boarding schools?
Some of them, yes. So the system was kind of changed over time, and there were certain ideas about how the system should be operated. It varied a bit, and it never fully worked as some of the most ambitious people early on had intended it to. But by and large, there was a system by which children were expected to go to what are called day schools first, so schools where they would generally live at home, attend school. So those were on the reservation, but then there were also boarding schools on the reservation as well. And of course, some of the reservations were quite big or in remote areas. And then the boarding school would be, for example, at the local Indian agency, which was kind of the central place of white administration on the reservation. So then the school would be there, and then students would live at those schools. But there were still more opportunities for parents to visit those schools and things like that. So there were definitely those boarding schools as well. It is also worth mentioning perhaps here that I'm looking specifically at the government schools. There were other schools as well that were run by missionary organizations, various Christian denominations. Some of those were initially funded by the federal government as well, but the federal government kind of started prioritizing its own schools, and by the early 1900s, that funding was phased out, but a lot of those schools continued to operate independently of the federal government. So you had kind of these parallel systems. Yeah.
I think when I prepared myself for this interview, like the first question that I kind of asked myself was, what was the general goal of these schools? And then actually in one of the articles you shared with me, there was a quote that I found really interesting that said, school was the government's attempt to completely restructure indigenous minds and identities. And so I wondered, how do you do this? What were the mechanisms? How did this restructuring process work?
Well, basically, especially at the off-reservation boarding schools, as I briefly mentioned there, the thinking really was to really immerse them in their vision of United States society. There's the infamous quote that often gets quoted by the founder of Carlisle, Richard Henry Pratt, to kill the Indian in him and save the man, which is kind of a similar sentiment to what you quoted there. So this kind of strange idea that somehow in these children there were kind of there was an Indian part of them, quote unquote, and there was a potentially civilized part of them. But another famous quote is one that I don't know exactly, but it's along very similar lines. But it's a quote that refers to baptism and basically talks about holding children under until they are civilized, and that was very much the idea of the schools. Very much that total immersion was very much central to the schools. And so how that works in practice was that the students would have free time, but even their free time was controlled a lot of the time, especially in earlier decades. So they would have a curriculum throughout the day, part academic, classroom education, part vocational, learning various industrial trades. And then in their free time, they would attend assemblies. A lot of the schools built auditoriums. Of course, the school bands were a big part of that. They would perform. Students would march to and from different school buildings, from meals to classrooms to dormitories. So those kind of, by having students even in those kinds of moments where they kind of had a bit of downtime going from one building to another, even there having them march, kind of really occupying them throughout the day was really thought to be effective. And of course, it is very intimidating in a lot of ways and very immersive. And something that scholars have written about as well is the fact that the school campuses were built according to a certain logic as well, with school buildings being, especially for children who came from more remote communities that still lived in more kind of traditional types of housing, for whom even the architecture of these types of schools was very foreign. And so even living in those kinds of spaces was already kind of a clash with their kind of cultural values and sensibilities. And so all of that, plus keeping them in these schools for up to 5 years, that was kind of the standard at Carlisle and a lot of other schools, that students were expected to stay there for the full 5 years. And then as a final point, too, that in addition to everything they did within the schools, to make sure that students were occupied during, for example, during summers as well, a lot of the schools had so-called outing programs by which students would work away from the schools. So girls would work for local families as basically as servants a lot of the time, whereas boys would work on farms, those kinds of jobs. Some of them would have other jobs as well, as printers at newspapers or things like that. But yeah, that was another aspect of really trying to control student lives and really immersing them in U.S. society and really taking up as much of their time as possible and not really allowing them, and that's, of course, the other side of it, not allowing them to engage with their own cultures, not allowing them to speak their own languages, to perform or sing their own music for the most part. Yeah.
When they were working during the last year of school, was this meant as a sort of like internship to also make it easier for them to like get jobs after school?
It kind of was the idea, but most of the time it wasn't even really. It was kind of talked about in terms of skills, but there was a strange disconnect with the boarding schools as well, where they were especially early on, very obsessed with seeing where students ended up, what kind of work they were doing, and making sure that students wouldn't go back to reservations, or if they would go back to reservations, that they would kind of help educate their people and educate their families. But then the things they learned at schools didn't necessarily prepare them for reservation life. And so there certainly was an idea that they would learn skills that would be useful to them in urban environments or in white society more generally. And this is also something that some of the kind of proponents of assimilation, the supporters, were kind of idealistic about, but that in practice didn't really work, and ran into ideas about race and class, where especially in Western schools, the outing program kind of became a system of cheap labor, where rather than going into a family and living with the family and working for the family, students would just end up working in beet fields and even on cotton plantations
Oh God.
in some places.
Oh, that's
Um,
terrible.
yeah. So, yeah. So it really is complex in that way.
What I found really interesting in one of the articles you shared with me was that there was a photo of a student called Tom Torolino, and there was a photo of him like before he went to that school, or like on his first day or something, and then like an after photo. And so in the before photo, he had long hair, he was wearing earrings and a necklace, and then in the after photo, he had short hair, was wearing a suit, and he just looked very like westernized. And so I found this like external appearance related kind of assimilation really interesting. Just the fact that as soon as you get to this school, like you get your hair cut. And then the students also received new names, if I understood that correctly, right?
Yeah. So yeah, well, that's one of the most famous photographs, but those photographs were very common. Those photographs were also used to sell the idea of the boarding schools, to show, oh, look what good work we're doing. There's an interesting, well, various scholars have written about the story of Tom Torolino as well. The fact that, later in life, he kind of combined both sides of his identity. He still embraced his Navajo identity as well. And so there's been obviously a lot of criticism of that, but it is a very stark image that tells us a lot about kind of how the people in charge of this system viewed the work that they were doing. The haircutting, of course, is very culturally significant as well, because for a lot of tribal nations, a lot of cultures, long hair was something that was just kind of part of who they were. And the only reason to cut your hair in a lot of cultures was grieving, was if someone died, that was when you cut your hair. And so it was very traumatic for children to have those kinds of things happen to them. But yeah, those photographs were a key part of selling the schools. I've forgotten your question now.
Don't worry about
That's
it.
focused on the first part of it. Yeah.
My question was also about the giving new names to kids. Like, what was that
Right.
something that was commonly done to like everyone?
I'm not sure. It's not something I've seen too much of, but especially early on, and with some of the tribes that were considered quote unquote less civilized, and that didn't necessarily have easy kind of first name, last name names, it was common practice to at least change their names. And then there's different stories about how that went, whether students were assigned the names or whether I've read accounts where teachers apparently wrote a set of names on the blackboard, and then students would go up in front of the classroom and point out to a name, and then that's your name now. And this is something you see in student records as well, where sometimes you might see an American name and a native name in their own language or not. And this is very much part of the process that was very much central to the schools, and that is very much present in those photographs as well, of kind of making Native Americans legible in some way, of making them kind of fit into U.S. society more easily, kind of from the government's perspective of having kind of subjects you can control more easily, and kind of having them, not having names that have cultural significance and names that are complicated, so to say, by kind of Western or by English spelling and pronunciation standards, and instead giving them names like really strange names sometimes too, where you see students who ended up being named after presidents like George Washington or Grover Cleveland and things like that, where you can very clearly see that the schools kind of imposed names on them to some degree. So yeah.
Were families, like native families, actually forced to like send their kids to these schools, or was it more of a thought like, oh, I want my kid to like have it better than me and like to get access to education, and therefore they were sent to the boarding schools?
hmm Yeah, that's a very well. It's basically uh, yes to all of it. The reasons why children attend schools are very complex and really different from family to family, and it also kind of differs from generation to generation as well. And even within a generation, it differed between kind of different factions within tribes, different between tribes as well. So it's hard to give one answer to it. But I think it is but there was a combination. There were certainly plenty of instances where the government forced them. As far as I remember, I'm not 100% sure, but as far as I remember, there was never a compulsory education law, or if there was, it didn't come until kind of the early 1900s. But there
Mhm.
were other tactics that they would use. So, for example, especially for families living on reservations, they were in some cases dependent on the Indian agent for food and other resources. And so there would kind of be extortion sometimes of like, okay, we need, children to go to the schools and we want your children in the schools. So s- send your children or you're not going to get your rations. Those kinds of things did happen. I'm not sure how common that was. But then as you said, there was certainly the other side to it as well, where um, well, again, also because of poverty and things like that, um, it was a way to get to have children be in an environment where they would have food and clothing and a roof over their heads if in larger families that didn't have a lot of means. Um, and that is something that was true early on, but is also something that happened again, for example, in the 1930s during the Great Depression, where families were kind of trying to make their ends meet and trying to make ends meet, and the boarding schools were kind of a place that they could send children
Mhm.
to have them be cared for in that way, as well as kind of those ideas of, um, yeah, getting an education, being able to function in U.S. society, but then also sometimes the idea of sending children to schools to kind of learn the white man's ways and to have them learn those things, come back to their tribes and help their tribes and tribal nations to basically serve as intermediaries between their communities and white authorities. So yeah, very broad and very complex topic that's hard to generalize about, but those are some of the kind of different factors at play, and as well as, of course, family connections as well. If your parents would have gone, then it might have been more likely that
Mhm.
children also went. Yeah.
Yeah. So when you were saying people went back to their reservation and kind of brought the education along with them, were there also like alternative, I don't want to call it schools, but like maybe alternative ways of native education within the community?
That's something I can't really speak to because it's not something I see much of in the sources, because a lot of the sources I look at are kind of government sources and they don't really talk about those things, or if they talk about them, then it's like, kind of demeaning. Um, but I'm sure there was education happening, just not necessarily in the context of a school in the kind of
Mhm.
American sense of the word. And of course, also the fact that a lot of education happened through transmission between generations and feast days and other kind of celebrations and events in the community. Um, but yeah, when we kind of think about Native American schools, that is as kind of a movement that is much, much later. That's like 1970s. Um,
Mhm.
so yeah, and in terms of institutions, at least, yeah.
Yeah. I
Which
was
again
actually
is not to say that it didn't happen, but
I was actually astonished by the sheer numbers that were referenced in an article you shared with me. It said that by 1900, there were 18,000 children who attended 153 government-operated boarding schools. And then there were nearly 4,000 who attended the 154 day schools. These are huge numbers, and I wasn't really expecting that, to be honest, that it's such a huge thing, and yet I hadn't really been aware of it at all, to be really honest.
Mm-hmm. Yep. I don't recall exactly from what year was or what the percentage was, but there's some data as well for specific years where it was like this percentage of the Native American population or at least the population of Native American children was in a boarding school, and it's really a staggering percentage. So yeah, definitely, and it was huge, and it's something that, and it's one of the things that kind of drew me to this topic as well, is the fact that, of course, in Native American communities, it doesn't matter where you go, people have stories of their parents, their grandparents, their great-grandparents attending these schools, of the way their communities were affected by the schools. And then once I talk to white Americans about the schools, it's like, oh, but it happened in Canada and we don't know about this. And I'm sure it didn't really happen in the US. And it's changed a little bit. During the Biden administration, there was some effort to investigate what happened and what the government's involvement was. There's been some more exposure in popular culture. I've been getting, last time I was in the US for a longer period in 2023, 2024, I was getting quite a few comments from people about, oh, the boarding schools, I saw it on one of the spin-offs for the TV show. That was, well, anyway, one of those Western TV shows that was very popular. So the boarding schools were kind of featured on there. So people got some exposure from that.
Mm-hmm.
But by and large, it is still very much under-recognized by the general American population. Of course, the current administration is kind of ignoring that it ever happened.
Oh God, that's so sad.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So yeah, but then again, locally, a lot is happening. There are Native American organizations doing a lot of work. Some of the former schools have kind of associations and kind of museums and things like that on a local level are continuing the work of bringing this more out into the open. But yeah,
Mm-hmm.
it's certainly an uphill battle of bringing Americans' attention to this history. Yeah.
Mm. And I think you've also done research in the United States about this, right? I think you went to Albuquerque,
Mm-hmm.
if I remember correctly. Did
Yeah.
you do archival work mostly, or did you also like go to museums about this history, or how exactly was it related to your project?
Yeah. So during my master's, I spent time in Riverside, California, doing research in the Sherman Institute. And then now during the PhD, I've been in Albuquerque, also doing archival work. But yeah, in both places, I've been very interested in kind of seeing how the schools are remembered, what's left of the schools. And those two cities are very interesting to compare as well, because Sherman Institute is one of the schools that still operates today. It is known as Sherman Indian High School, and it stopped being well, it's still funded through the government, but it's not a government-run school. And so it was one of the schools that switched to being indigenous led in the 1970s and is now Sherman Indian High School. And so it is now a place where Native American children and teenagers come to learn about their own cultures and about other Native American cultures. And it's kind of a normal high school. So it's a very different space, and it's very much a space that works toward revitalizing cultures and keeping this history alive. And they have a small museum, so I spend time there. And then Albuquerque, the school operated into the 1980s, and then it closed, and then the campus fell into disrepair, and it was finally demolished in the early 2000s. And so there isn't really anything left of the school campus, but there is now, in the area where the school campus used to be, the Pueblo tribes have a big cultural center and museum, which also has a small exhibit about the history of the school. And so, yeah, so it's interesting to see. But then in both places, I would talk to local people about my research, and they wouldn't really know about it. Albuquerque even has a very long street that basically runs from east to west all the way through the city called Indian School Road. And so people would know about that, but then they wouldn't necessarily know why the road is
Oh,
called that or what the history behind that is. And then same with Sherman Institute, even though Sherman Indian School still operates today. I talked to someone who attended a college that's basically next door to Sherman Indian School, and they had no idea what was just down the
oh,
street from them or what the history of that was. That's been
oh,
very striking to see. And it's something I'm very interested in as well, kind of the way that memory functions in those types of communities. And
oh.
especially, and I can talk more about this, but especially considering how prominent the schools were in those communities 100 years ago. That's, yeah, quite a
Mhm.
contrast as well.
Oh God, I was just reminded of my research trip last year to Washington, D.C. I went to the, I think it's called Indian-American Museum, which is also about
Yeah.
Native American history. And I remember there was a video that they showed, which was basically a street survey that they took. And they asked people, so what do you know about Pocahontas? And then most people were like, oh yeah, I've just seen like the Disney film. There was very
Mhm.
little awareness about Native American history, which it was kind of sad. Yeah.
Yep. Yep. That is a big problem in the United States. That, yeah.
So, since we were already talking about Sherman Institute a bit, is it exclusively for Native American students?
As far as I know, yes. Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah, and like back in the day, back in, let's say, the early 20th century, were all the government operated boarding schools exclusively for Native American students, or were there also, for example, white kids who attended?
No, it was really quite separate.
Hmm.
Yeah, the only places where it gets a bit more complex is kind of the Southwest, where there was kind of talk about school officials complaining that, oh, are these really Native Americans or are they actually Mexicans or things like that? But for the
Mm-hmm.
most part, the the students were Native American, and it was quite specifically, well, yeah, separate in that way, and that. Um, Yeah, that even I think the children of employees would attend kind of other schools in the town or things like that. They, as far as I know, wouldn't really attend classes with the Native American students. Although I've come across one or two examples where kind of older students of staff members would play with the school bands, but that was really rare. And then the one interesting exception was Hampton Institute in Virginia, which was actually an African American school that had a program for Native Americans for a few decades, and that is one of the only schools that where Native Americans attended school alongside African Americans.
Hmm.
Um, but it was a very similar school in a lot of other ways to the other off-reservation schools. But yeah.
And were the schools exclusively for one gender, or was it mixed boys and girls schools?
Yeah, so that's a good question as well, and a really interesting one as well. And it gets back to your question about the ways in which kind of they tried to change students' minds and ideas that this whole um, kind of American notion of gender was something that they also wanted to impose on the students. And so the schools were for both boys and girls. I think all the government schools were co-ed. I think only the mission schools would have been kind of separated a lot of the time, but that was also because of the way that they would be taught either by nuns or monks and things like that, or priests
Hmm.
rather. But yeah, the schools were mixed, um, but boys and girls were very much kept separate as much as possible. Of course, the dormitories were separate, but also school activities were separate. I think classroom education would have been shared. Um, I'm not sure about kind of like meals and things like that, but I would expect that in a lot of schools, even that might have been separated. And it also translated to the extracurricular programs, the education program where girls would learn certain trades and boys would learn other trades because there were kind of feminine um, jobs and masculine jobs and things like that. And then with the music program as well, that the bands that I look at were almost exclusively for male students until the 1930s. Again, there are interesting exceptions that I've come across that I haven't been able to find too much information on, but there are a few smaller schools where there were mixed bands, and then I've come across one photograph from Pipestone Indian School up in Minnesota that apparently had a girls' brass band in the 1910s. I haven't been able to find anything else about it. But for the most part, brass bands were seen as kind of masculine spaces, as instruments that girls shouldn't play, things like that. And so instead, the girls in the schools would be in so-called guitar and mandolin clubs, because those would be thought of as more feminine instruments. And so those were really popular music organizations for girls. Yeah. And then there's kind of other kind of glee clubs and choirs that were sometimes mixed, sometimes separate as well. Yeah. So yeah.
Yeah. Fun fact, actually, I also went to a boarding school. I was an external student though, so I lived at home and I went to school every single day, but a lot of kids from my class were living at the boarding school. And so I think compared to these schools that you look at, everyday life was super chill at my school. Like usually you would get up sometime in the morning, go to class. You had class in the morning and afternoon, then maybe some extracurricular activities later. And then in the evening, you could just hang out with your friends. And that was like everyday life. But I think the native boarding schools that you looked at, they had a very structured day-to-day life, and it was more disciplined, right?
Certainly, yes. The kind of thing you describe really wouldn't be life for students at these schools until the 1930s, 40s, 50s. At that point, maybe, but even then, there was a lot of work to do at the schools and a lot of activities and a lot of things happening all the time. But by that time, students had a little bit more freedom. But yeah, the period I look at kind of from the 1880s through the 1920s, 1930s was quite strict, quite full schedules. And you see these schedules where it was like get up at 6, breakfast 6:30, and then class, and then kind of went on and on like that during the day. And then even on weekends, there would be, of course, church services on Sundays, and sometimes work duty on Saturdays, and then parades and inspections. And so a big part of that as well is something that I don't think I've talked about as much yet, but I kind of alluded to before with the marching and kind of the, and one of the key features of this boarding school system was that it operated according to kind of a military system in which students would usually wear uniforms, they would march, they would have kind of different rituals to salute the flag. The flag would be raised in the morning and lowered in the evening with all kinds of fanfare, and then also those kind of parades and what were called dress inspections on Sundays as well. Kind of really big events and a lot of discipline. And so students would be organized, yes, by the year and the kind of grade they were in, but also by companies. And so different companies would have officers and things like that at most of the schools. And so students had those kind of roles as well. And they weren't just students, but they were also kind of these quasi soldiers in some ways. As well. And the thinking behind this was that this would somehow kind of make them loyal citizens and make them disciplined, exactly as you said there, disciplined in the sense too of not just having their schedule disciplined, but also of being disciplined physically and mentally. Of course, all of this is very paradoxical in a lot of ways, of course, because if you want, functioning citizens and people who are kind of functioning members of United States society, how useful is it to subject children to this kind of system for years on end?
Yeah, it doesn't sound child appropriate at all.
No. And certainly in terms of kind of the cultural differences as well, it's really quite cruel in a lot of ways. And it also came with quite a strict system of punishments and you had to behave a certain way, or there would be certain punishments, and it varied from school to school how strict the punishments were. But there was a lot of punishment. A lot of the schools would have prisons, or at least kind of jails, where students would be locked up as well
Oh God.
for certain periods of time, and things like that were unfortunately quite a regular part of school life. Um, and it's something I've tried to find out more about in my research as well, of like, where did this idea come from, or why was it this way? And it's not something I've really found an answer to, but I think one of the big reasons was that Richard Henry Pratt, the founder of Carlyle, was a military officer, and he actually, before he started Carlisle, he had overseen a group of prisoners of war from different Native American tribes. And so with them, of course, those were adults, but with them, he had run kind of a similar, really an experiment, honestly, of having them in a fort, having them drill and take lessons and kind of do all of these things that he would later apply to his kind of education model at Carlisle. And so it makes sense, and is very kind of one-on-one from the military to the schools in that way.
Mm. Now, you've already kind of alluded to punishments if you were not compliant at the school. And so apparently there were official rules that forbade corporeal punishment, but it was still a thing, right? And so I wanted to ask you, how common was it?
Yeah, that's something that I find difficult to say, again, because especially because of the nature of the records. Because if things were really bad, like I know, for example, at Phoenix Indian School in the late 1920s, things were really bad, and some of the employees filed complaints against some of the other employees, and then it became a big scandal. Then we know about it. But in other cases, of course, it wasn't really reported on, so we don't really know. But in general, of course, this isn't the focus of my research, but I have looked a little bit at kind of discipline and kind of the bans in the context of discipline as well. Is that, it's hard to say how common it was, but it certainly occurred. And it's interesting as well, because I feel like in a lot of the sources I see, they focus more on kind of more gentle, quote unquote, gentle forms of discipline. Like there are examples where music was used as kind of punishment, where they would have to sit and listen to some kind of classical piece being played on the piano, because that would calm them down and that would kind of help them work through their behavior that the school considered to be a problem. So yeah, as far as corporal punishment goes, I'm not sure how common it was, but it certainly occurred, and it certainly wasn't unusual.
All right.
Definitely, yeah.
Thinking back to my time at school, I think most students who went to the boarding school actually went home to see their families every single weekend. And I was wondering, how often were the students at the native boarding schools allowed to go back home and see their families?
Yeah, so again, it varies a lot, and even some of the off-reservation schools were closer to communities and kind of have more possibilities. But a lot of the times, students would kind of be there for as long as they were there, whether it was the full 5 years, 3 years, 4 years. And in that time, they wouldn't really see at least their parents and grandparents. Sometimes they might see siblings or cousins if they were in the same school, but otherwise they were, for the most part, separated from their communities.
Oh, that's so sad.
Sometimes, it really is tragic. Yeah. And then sometimes tribal leaders would visit the schools. So then there would be kind of people from their community, and in some cases those were parents as well, visited the schools. But yeah, for the most part, children were quite isolated from their parents and families for extended periods of time, and that was very much by design as well.
Yeah, but then one article you shared with me also talked about how some students went off campus sometimes and like took the train and went to like other places. So was it a thing that was allowed? Because I can't really imagine that it is allowed, or that it was allowed, from all the things we've talked about so far.
Yeah, no, exactly. And that's also why I shared that article as well, is that it's easy to talk about the boarding schools as these kind of isolated spaces that were effectively prisons. And it's an interesting conversation to have as well of what the schools actually were, and it depends on kind of who you ask. And some people are quite outspoken about not even referring to these institutions as schools because of everything that happened there. But they were still educational institutions. Other people even go so far as to compare them to concentration camps,
Oh my
which I
God.
think is quite extreme.
Oh.
But it speaks to kind of the feelings about these schools. But I think a lot of those conversations tend to focus on the schools as kind of a bubble. And certainly student movement was controlled. Students didn't have a lot of freedom to just go where they wanted to go. But within that, being in the schools still gave them opportunities to go beyond the schools, whether it was on those kind of outing programs that I mentioned, to work in different places, whether it was kind of in that article where older students might have more freedom to go into town if the school was close to a town, and visit stores and things like that. Especially kind of into the 20th century, it would become a bit more common as well for some schools on weekends to allow students, or to take groups of students under supervision, but to take groups of students into town and to have them visit some places in towns as well. And then there is, of course, all of the travel that relates to music and sports, which I think is something I try to highlight as well in my research, in terms of that. Yes, the boarding schools were very restrictive spaces, and the students were very restricted in what they could and couldn't do, where they could and couldn't go. But certain students who attended the boarding schools had opportunities for mobility as well. And so the bands are a really fascinating example of that, where the bands would travel to all kinds of venues to perform for local audiences, from kind of parades for various holidays to state fairs to even the world fairs in different parts of the country, and go on different tours. And so I think those kinds of stories are important to incorporate into kind of the narratives about the boarding schools, and kind of how we think about and talk about the boarding schools, and not just to see them as these isolated spaces, but as kind of hubs as well, that kind of connected kind of reservation communities and other Native American communities, and kind of gave young Native Americans a wide variety of experiences. But then also, which is less present with the bands, because they were well supervised. But as that article also points out, kind of an aspect of neglect as well, of students not being well supervised and ending up in dangerous situations. Yeah.
I think that's actually a nice interlude into the marching band topic, because one question I
Mhm.
ask myself is, I don't know if anyone is aware of what a marching band actually is, because it's not a thing in Germany at all. I don't
Mhm.
think it's a thing in other European countries either. So I was wondering, why is it such a common thing in the United States? Does every school usually have a marching band? Like, I didn't go to an American high school. I really don't know about this.
Yeah, it's something I don't know too much about, but as far as I understand, yeah, nowadays it really is kind of across the board, across American society, that marching bands are kind of everywhere, especially in schools and higher education, that marching bands are a big part of the culture still. And it's interesting because nowadays it's kind of confined to education. And this is something that I've kind of learned through my research as well, and something that I'm still kind of piecing together, because I think it, understanding the history of the marching band phenomenon in general, helps to understand a bit better what made the boarding school bands both unique and more like kind of the rest of American music culture at this time. So um, basically, the late 19th century was kind of the heyday of the marching band. It was kind of the kind of popular music of the time in a lot of ways. Um, and so John Philip Sousa was perhaps the most famous example of that. He was a band leader, and he was kind of a rock star, to use a very anachronistic term, but he was a band leader who composed marches and who led his own band for decades, and whose music was very popular. And then kind of every town would have its own local marching bands. Companies would have their marching bands. Schools, not so much during this time, which is interesting because the boarding schools did already have marching bands, but the kind of high school marching band phenomenon that we know today didn't really start until after the First World War, when a lot of military musicians um, started to find work and kind of ended up working in schools and
Oh, wow.
leading bands in the schools. Um, but the kind of marching band phenomenon of the late 19th century that the Indian school bands also grew out of comes more out of the Civil War and the fact that, like several decades later during the First World War, there were a lot of musicians. Quite a few of the band directors in the boarding schools were veterans of the Civil War as well. And so really it was just a matter of marching bands were just extremely popular at the time. And so it was a good way for the schools to get the public's attention as well and to kind of play into popular sentiments, and especially in more remote communities in the American West where the school band was kind of the only band around.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, so yeah, and then in terms of the kind of music they played, it varies a bit over time as well. And the more elaborate bands had both kind of brass instruments, so the horns and later saxophones as well as kind of woodwinds. And for that reason, they would play both kind of marches, so kind of the more military music, and really the brass music that we kind of associate with marching bands. They would play arrangements of popular music, which I think is what the marching bands today are best known for, of playing arrangements of kind of popular music. That is something that happened back then as well. And then also arrangements of classical music that were written for the marching bands. And so all of that we see in the boarding school bands as well. So this kind of repertoire that really brought different types of music to a mass audience in that way.
I just imagine if you were a student in one of these boarding schools, then it would probably be really attractive to join the marching band because, on the one hand, you've got band practice, which is kind of, I imagine, a nice contrast to the very strict and like structured military, like everyday school life. And on the other hand, as
Right.
you already said, sometimes you get to travel, play concerts in other places. So, how popular of a choice was it actually for the students to join the marching band?
Yeah, I think quite popular, and it's not always clear. And this is one of those things, as it goes with research, that's kind of frustrating. Where I don't always have a good sense of how students joined the marching bands, whether they really how much of a choice they had to sign up for it.
Hmm.
And again, there's quite a contrast too between earlier decades and later decades, where in later decades I think there was a bit more opportunity for them to say, okay, I want to be in the band, I'm going to kind of try out. A lot of the times it was students kind of being selected, students who were good and kind of students who maybe showed an inclination for music already. But I think it was certainly popular in that way, and that it was certainly had a certain prestige to it as well, where we do see that the bands were kind of part of the kind of elite of the schools in a lot of ways, and
Hmm.
um, that is very clear in the school newspapers as well, which kind of describe school life and kind of talk about various things that were happening at the schools. And they talk about the bands, but then they also talk about individual students. And a lot of those individual students whose names keep appearing again and again were members of the band and were involved in other activities in the school. And so they were quite um, significant individuals within the schools in that sense. Um, so yeah, I think for that reason, I would expect that kind of being in the band would have been popular as well. Um, Even though it is worth mentioning that, yes, I do think it was a respite from all the other work, and it was something that we do see that people look back on quite positively, kind of the bands and being in the bands. Um, the bands were also a lot of work. The bands had quite intense schedules as well, where they didn't
Hmm.
necessarily get time off from the other work. In some cases they did, but a lot of the time it was kind of on top of everything else. And especially if they had a bigger tour coming up or something like that, then it meant a lot of extra work as well. So that is worth mentioning, but still at the end of the day, I think it was fairly popular. And yeah.
I see. Now, I also read in one of the articles you shared with me that music lessons in school were also a way to kind of combat the performance practices at the reservations. And I wondered, why were these performance practices viewed in such a negative light? Was it because it was something foreign and maybe something that belonged to the native communities and they just wanted to like assimilate the students and make them embrace, let's say, like classical American ways of making music instead?
Yeah, I think that is one side of it. So really just the assimilation side of it and having them kind of just be Americans and forget about kind of everything else. But then I think on a deeper level, it gets back to that idea of getting into student minds really and kind of changing their minds. And so that one book I mentioned earlier that presents a history of music at one of the schools in Oregon, the title of that book is to win the Indian heart, which I think is a quote from a historical source, but that was the idea as well behind a lot of this, that civilized, what they refer to as civilized music would somehow, and it's interesting to see that in the sources people talk about this as if it's kind of some self-evident process, but then reading it today in the 21st century, it sounds like, just magic, where it's just like, oh, if they just even just hear Bach or Beethoven, they'll become civilized and they'll, you know, um, just abandon everything they know. And then you're like, okay, but how is this supposed to work in practice? But to a lot of people at the time, it was very self-evident for some reason that kind of cutting children off from those practices and kind of replacing that with other types of music would not just assimilate them, but also civilize them in their mindset. And a big part of that is, as well, was either an inability or an unwillingness to understand the complexity of Native American musical traditions, because all the time they just talk about it as Indian music. They don't really make a lot of distinctions between different cultural traditions, which would be equivalent to, I don't know, just saying that, German and Finnish music is just European music, and it's the same, when obviously those are very long, different histories from very different cultures. But as with all things Native American, those vast cultural differences got erased and ignored into kind of this idea of Indian music that they were against, and that to some people was barely even considered music. So it even operated at that level of giving them music where they had just been playing drums or playing flutes before, but that's not real music. And now we're going to
Oh,
teach them real music, and yeah, those kinds of ideas.
okay. So also a way of kind of subordinating Native American culture to like the mainstream white American culture.
Yes, that's the other thing I was going to say, but I didn't want to make my answer too long there, but that that was the other big part of it as well. There was this very popular genre of classical music in kind of around the turn of the 20th century that was known as by different names, but nowadays it tends to be known as Indianist music. So this was classical music that evoked the musical traditions of Native Americans, or at least it evoked the Euro-American idea of Native American music, which went hand in hand with this mindset at the time that Native American cultures were disappearing. So there were a lot of musicologists going out into Native American communities, recording music, both making audio recordings and just writing down sheet music, and then getting frustrated because, of course, the music didn't work well with their practices of music notation. But then because so much Native American music was being recorded, that music was then also incorporated into kind of classical music making. And so these classical pieces were then kind of seen as true American music because they, and again, so much of this is so very paradoxical, where on the one hand, they wanted to get rid of anything Native American, but at the same time, it was as authentically American as you could get, because of course that was what they thought of as the original music of the continent. So they still wanted a version of that, but they wanted it on their terms as part of their musical tradition. Also in a way to give some kind of authenticity to their culture, which is a very kind of classical example of what scholars have talked about when they talk about processes of settler colonialism as well, of kind of incorporating and absorbing kind of fragments of Native American cultures and indigenous cultures into the kind of dominant settler society. And that is something where the bands played an important role as well, because that music then also appears on the repertoire of the school bands as kind of, okay, this is your culture, this is Native American culture, and you can be Native American if you have to be something, rather be a white American, but if you have to be still a bit Native American, then this is your culture, not, whatever your families or your ancestors know and do, but this kind of white version, white interpretation of Native American music, that is now your culture. With the big asterisk that some of the individuals I look at in my research made this type of music as well, that Native Americans themselves kind of, who embraced aspects of assimilation thinking, kind of wanted to show what Native Americans were capable of, and so they started making these types of symphonies as well. That's what makes history interesting at the end of the day, these kinds of complexities, that, yes, this was very much a kind of settler white kind of process, and something that was kind of came from their side, but it is something that Native Americans also engaged in and used to give their version of that kind of assimilationist narrative as well.
Yeah, it kind of reminded me of these. There is this trend of like having a genealogical test, like Ancestry, for example, and these people who are like, oh yeah, I'm like 8% Native American or something, as I was seen as something like attractive, slightly exotic, but the person is like not interested enough to like actually learn about Native American cultures and like actually do research on it, but it's just used as like a trendy thing to kind of associate yourself with that.
Yeah, which is something that I think is important to emphasize as well, is that of course, nowadays we talk about this in terms of tribal sovereignty, but the fact that Native American nations were foreign nations, really. They weren't just ethnic groups or racial groups within the U.S., but that is how a lot of people kind of think about it. Oh, Native American is an ethnicity, or even being part of a tribal nation is just another ethnicity, like being kind of German American or Dutch American, whatever. But that is not how Native Americans see it, and that is not how historically it has been, and that is not how it is today. But that is kind of the framing that the boarding schools in their time also very much were part of, and were kind of showing as well, like, okay, these are not foreign citizens, they are Americans first and foremost, and if they are Native American, then that's kind of maybe a racial thing or an ethnic thing, kind of depending on the context. And that is something that very much carries over today into a lot of the misunderstandings and the non-understandings of Native Americans that persist today. Yeah.
I was just thinking this huge power that was kind of assigned to music and to playing in the marching band. Like we're going to assimilate these students by like exposing them to American music, making them play American music, whatever. Was that also the case for, let's say, other extracurricular activities? Because I feel like when I think of schools and like boarding schools, the most popular extracurricular activity I can think of is like sports, like any kind of sports. So, for example, you're like in the basketball team, or you do running or something like that. So, was it a thing at Native American boarding schools? And was it also, if it was a thing, was it also something to assimilate the students in a way by making them join these activities?
Yes, certainly. Sports were as big as music at some of the schools, and that really included all kinds of sports, from football to basketball, which was a very new sport at the time as well, to running, to boxing even. So really a wide variety of sports, and the sports teams were very good as well. Like the bands, they were quite professional. And so Carlisle, because it was in Pennsylvania, their football team went up against, especially later when when a lot of the students at Carlisle were a bit older, even in their kind of late teens, some of the football teams from Carlisle went up against the Ivy League schools in competitions as well. And then you get all these really very typical newspaper articles kind of describing these sports competitions in very loaded terms, kind of using very military language of kind of the Native American football teams scalped the white team and things like that. But yeah, and so all of that was very much part of assimilation as well. Similar to the bands, this idea of kind of disciplining bodies and making children kind of use their bodies a certain way and kind of having a certain type of control over their body. That was very prominent in sports as well. Yeah.
One of the photos you sent me showed a student marching band with the students wearing these feathered headpieces. And I was wondering, like, were they allowed to at least wear that part of their native clothing, or was it more of a PR move? Like, we're going to present this as something like exotic that then also attracts attention from people who will listen to that kind of music. Like, what was the thought process behind
Mm-hmm.
this?
Yeah, that is something interesting as well, because the headdresses don't really start appearing with the marching bands until like the 1920s. Like in earlier decades, you'll see that they have a big drum with the name of the school, and then in the middle, there's maybe a drawing of the very stereotypical Indian head with the headdress. But for the most part, especially in early decades, they really wanted to like give a small hint that these were Native Americans, but otherwise they didn't want to draw attention to their Native American identities, kind of thinking from the school's perspective. And so that was kind of taboo for the school bands. And then later on, when they kind of started to give more leeway to Native American cultures, or at least their idea of Native American cultures, then it was a bit more common to have those kind of headdresses. But I think a lot of the time those would have been probably made by the school, not things that students brought with them to school or that were authentic in any way, especially in the context of the marching bands. Some schools had kind of Indian dance groups that would have been a bit more authentic, where students would have had a bit more opportunity to maybe wear some of their traditional clothing or their tribal kind of outfits and things like that. But yeah, with the bands, it was more wearing uniforms, and then later on you start seeing the headdresses appear as kind of, it's almost like this idea of kind of a remnant of their heritage as Native Americans, of kind of like, sure, because at that point it felt kind of safe in a way to allude to their Native American heritage. Yeah.
Yeah, something I kind of had to think of was also in last episode when I talked with Henry about Hawaiian colonialism and the role of the tourist industry. We also talked about exhibitions and human exhibitions in particular,
Mm-hmm.
and that these were kind of also a PR thing of showing, okay, the missionary effort there is working. We're doing a good job there. We're taming the savages in a way. And so I thought, were the marching bands similar in a way that, okay, you show these Native American students and you're like, look, they're playing our music and they're assimilated. That is the good job that we're doing in these schools.
Yep. It was exactly 100% the same idea. Yep. It was very much showing, yep, this is what the schools are doing. And then you see people reacting to oh, they're playing classical music, and this music is the pinnacle of civilization, and here you have these Native Americans playing it, and wow. And then of course the schools, love that, and then they spread those kinds of comments around as well. So it was very much that. And that is one of the interesting things as well, that the schools were like, oh, look, we've made white Americans basically. But then almost all the commentary is just very exoticizing a lot of the time. Like, sure, they're very excited about their proficiency at the music, but almost all of the time, commentators would write or talk about these bands and their performances through the lens of we're seeing Native Americans who we never would have expected from our kind of narrow mindset to play this type of music. And it's interesting because they are Native American and we wouldn't expect this from them, which is a really interesting thing. And again, one of the kind of paradoxes of the boarding schools as well, that it was trying to achieve something that on the surface they achieved, but for the Native American students themselves, they maintained other parts of their identities. And to white audiences, they remained Native Americans in a lot of ways, even if their understanding of Native Americans wasn't necessarily the same as what students understood it to be. But it was, yeah. So, yeah, and then certainly the public concerts were a big part of that. And there was a big tourism industry around the schools as well, where people would visit the schools and kind of look at the school buildings. And then a lot of schools had band concerts on Sundays that were very popular, where some schools drew, I think, over 1,000 visitors sometimes, and there would be automobiles lining the roads to the school and things like that. So these were really kind of big events. And then also the World Fairs of the 1890s were, of course, these massive events and these massive displays of imperialism and colonialism. And so some of the school bands performed there as well. Again, with this same idea, and some of the not necessarily, well, somewhat connected to the bands, but some of these world fairs had model Indian schools as well, where they literally put students from different schools into a kind of fake school for a couple of weeks, so that people visiting these fairs could kind of tour the schools and see the kind of work that the schools were doing. And then there would be school bands there as well.
Oh my God, that sounds terrible.
Yeah.
I was wondering, were people who like listened to these marching bands, did they also appreciate the musical talent and the quality of the music, or was it then still viewed as sort of inferior to white marching bands?
No, yeah, that's one of the interesting things actually, that from all accounts it was really top-notch music. And that's one of the things as well. It's really interesting to see where it's not just people writing and saying, okay, this is really excellent, this is a great rendition of this particular piece, or things like that. But then also that some of the bands competed in state fairs, would have band competitions. So the school bands would compete in those, and they would win, and they would kind of beat other bands, and they would be crowned the best band in the state. So that really shows that these were very kind of professional organizations that really played music very well. And an interesting thing about that as well is that a lot of the concerts would include solo performances as well. So most of the numbers would be the full band, but then there would usually be one or two solos by kind of more talented students. And so these would be highlighted in newspaper reviews as well, for example, where local white journalists would comment on kind of how well these individuals played. So that's really interesting to see as well, that they actually were that good.
Yeah. When did these boarding schools actually, I don't want to say stop operating, because as you said, Sherman Institute is still a high school, but like when did they become more of a regular school? Or maybe some of them also stopped operating, I'm sure, but when did the system start to change generally?
Yeah, so boarding school history tends to be divided into, I think, 4 or 5 periods, where it kind of goes back as far as 1819, when Congress first started funding mission schools. Then you have kind of that early period up to 1879, when Carlisle opens and the federal government really steps up its involvement. You get all of these big schools and really the vast expansion of the system. Then that kind of lasts into the 1960s, but then there's kind of a break in the 1930s when the government during the Roosevelt administration does away with this military system and all of that kind of stuff. And makes more of an effort to start teaching children about their own cultures. But by and large, the emphasis was still very much on assimilation. But there's kind of a shift to where the system becomes a little bit less harmful, at least the government schools. And then that kind of continues through the termination era into the late 1960s. And that's kind of when the shift comes, when the last schools either close or switch to indigenous-led control. Although I do think some of the mission schools went on a bit longer than that, and the mission schools were also much harsher environments for longer than the government schools, because the government schools had those reforms, but the mission schools didn't really have those. So basically kind of the 1960s, of course, the whole period of kind of Native American activism alongside with other changes in United States society, leading into the kind of self-determination era of the 1970s in Native American policy, is what kind of ends the assimilation era permanently, effectively. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, luckily it stopped operating the way it did before, but still, this is a very long time. These are decades that these schools are operating in that way. So I think we can just be glad that there is more attention to this topic now and more research being done about this.
Yeah. And it's interesting to see as well that scholars have been researching this since the 1970s, really, and then 1990s really gave a bigger boost to kind of the academic research, and then that's kind of continued in the past decades. But yeah, it's good to see that kind of that knowledge that has existed in Native American communities, that has existed in academia, is now also kind of entering the public debate. Hopefully at some point entering the education system in the U.S. as well, although that's probably a long shot with the way the American education system and history education in the U.S. works. Maybe in a few decades.
Well, it's hard to stay positive sometimes, but we'll try to be at least a little bit optimistic.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Right. Okay, so we're slowly approaching the end of our episode, and I always like to play this little game called This or That, where I give you two alternatives, and you have to choose one of them. So the first one would be organizing a conference or presenting at a conference.
I think presenting. I mean, even though I had a very small role in the conference and I didn't have to do all that much, I think it's still nice to just show up and just give the paper and then just sit back. Although I will say that organizing a conference is really nice too, especially, or at least being part of the organizing committee, just to kind of work on it and then read some of the abstracts in the fall and then put the program together in the spring, and then finally after almost a year to have the conference. And that's very rewarding as well.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, actually last year I also was part of a committee organizing a conference, and I did enjoy it, but like it was so much work. It was absolutely crazy. Fun fact, I'm helping to organize the next Spring Academy here at HCA.
Oh, nice. Yeah.
Yeah. It's gonna be good, hopefully. Anyway, next one. Finland or the Netherlands?
Well, I think I have to go with my home country of the Netherlands.
Tough choice, though. Right. Okay. Last one. Since I know that you speak a couple of foreign languages pretty well, learning a language in a class or with the help of Duolingo?
Oh, definitely a class. Yeah. Yeah. Not having taken Finnish classes for 3 years now, it's just hard to have structure when there's no class.
But you do have an insane streak at Duolingo. Like how long is it again?
I do. Well, it's over 2,500 days at this point. So.
Oh my god, how many years is that? Like, oh god.
Well, it's over 5 years. So.
Oh my god, I admire that so much. I think my longest streak on Duolingo was like 30 days or something. Which foreign languages do you speak though? I know it's a lot.
Yeah. So this is always a tough question to answer, and I'm always too humble with this. But I'm fluent in Dutch and English, of course. I understand German really well. I don't speak German very well, but I understand it very well, and I read novels in German. Um, and of course, I've been learning and speaking Finnish for almost 5 years now.
Wow.
Estonian, which is very close to Finnish and gets confusing sometimes. And then I know some Spanish as well. Um, and then just bits and pieces of other languages that I've dabbled in but don't really speak, including one Native American language, actually, Cherokee. But
Oh wow, that's so cool.
yeah.
Love that. Yeah. So, I also wanted to ask you, Vincent, I know that your main attention is and should be your dissertation, but like, are there
Mhm.
any other projects you're currently working on or that you have in mind that might have something to do with your dissertation topic, but are a bit in a different direction?
Yeah. Not not so much. I have one article that I've worked on ever since I was in Riverside, California, almost 7 years ago. That is also about the boarding schools and about music, but it is about the later period, and it looks at a very interesting case study of a um, band that formed at Sherman Institute in the 1950s that was made up of Tohono O'odham students. So the Tohono O'odham are a tribe in Arizona, and they kind of played their own music. Um, and it's a very fascinating case study because their music is a combination of their traditional music and then kind of German and Spanish or Mexican polkas. And
Wow.
so boarding school officials at Sherman in the 1950s didn't know what to make of it. And it's a really interesting case study. So I hope to get that published in the next year or so. And other than that, I don't have a lot of concrete things, but one of the things I would like to do more of as I kind of wrap up the dissertation is just to get more of the word out about this topic and about my research. So I'm also really happy I had a chance to talk with you today for that reason as well, to kind of start doing more of that and kind of start spreading the word. So that's something I
Uh,
look forward to doing as well.
Thanks so much. Yeah, I'm very eager to learn more and hopefully read that article because that mix
Hmm.
of different music styles, that sounds fascinating to me.
Hmm.
Yeah. So I also wanted to ask you, where can we follow your projects? Do you have a website? Do you have a social media channel that you maybe want to share?
Yeah, I've never been very good at um, keeping up my social media presence as an academic. I think the main place would be my LinkedIn page or my um, University of Helsinki page, although I'm not sure how up to date that is. But yeah,
There are
those
a
would be
couple
the
of
two.
things on there. I looked into it already.
Yeah, good.
Right, I'll put the link into the episode description.
Great.
Great.
Yeah.
Then again, Vincent, thank you so much for being my guest today. I learned so many new things, and I'm still fascinated with the topic. This was so interesting. Thanks for a great episode.
Yeah, thanks. I was really happy to share a few stories from my research, and yeah, thanks. Thanks for having me.
I'm glad to hear that. Okay, and then thanks to everybody who listened to this episode, and I'll hopefully see you in the next one. Goodbye.
Down the rabbit hole, research rabbit holes.